Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lifting. Today's episode is being filmed on 7/6/24. This is going to be very, very interesting. This is more taking a slightly different route than our normal disclosure in the media route. This is more on ancient Roman history, uh, and we're attempting to pinpoint certain infiltration points in history. So I'm going to actually just open this circle at the beginning right now within True Benevolence with no conflicting agendas as of this right now. Only True Benevolence gets to speak today and gets to give any downloads as of today. And if people are wondering about this on my face, I don't have time to explain it in this episode. Context is in an episode of the lifting we did called the Agent Smith Effect. So by the time you see this, you will have seen that. Ryan, go right ahead.
All right, so we're going to go back to the first century BC. So this is the years basically 100 to 0. Um, at the time, you have Rome becoming ascendant in the Mediterranean. They've already taken out Carthage, who is their main rival going in the early and mid Republic. Carthage would have been in North Africa, modern day Tunisia. They will have conquered most of the Greeks, some of the Asia Minor Greeks, as well as like Mithridates, which was like a Greek adjacent kingdom up in the Black Sea, is not yet um, Romanized. And the Greeks themselves were kind of left alone to do what they will in Greece while paying lip service to Rome. Or they were still in the weird alliance state where they were client states of Rome, but they were not actually conquered people. They were just allied to Rome, but they still basically paid taxes and things to the Romans. Um, in the Near East, you have Ptolemaic Egypt still ruling Egypt, so a successor state of Alexander the Great. So these were Greeks and Macedonians ruling Egypt. The Levant is, I believe, still part of. Uh, that was like split, so the area around like Jerusalem and stuff. Let me just pull up a map of the Mediterranean during 100 BC
They gotta turn on.
for myself, mostly. Rome holds Greece, the northern coast of Africa from sort of where Africa dips in, right south of Italy, most of Spain, and the southernmost coast of France, Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, uh, and then basically the eastern coast of modern day Turkey. The area like north up where Byzantium is still owned by the Thracians, uh, and then Pontus, Bithynia, Cappadocia, they're the western bits of not the western, the eastern bits of Turkey, modern day Turkey. Armenia is still holding out over very far to the east on like sort of Turkey. The Parthian Empire is starting to encroach. Has the areas around like the Tigris and the Euphrates, like that's the true Middle East. And then you have the very end of the Seleucid Empire holding sort of what we would consider the Middle East, like the area around Jerusalem, Syria, Palestine, and then you have Ptolemaic Egypt in what we would consider Egypt down, and then more going west along the coast, straight south of Greece. They also held Crete, and at the time, I believe they kind of split rule um, Cyprus, which is in the eastern Mediterranean, sort of just off the coast of Turkey today. And then Antioch, uh, so Antioch was sort of the main city in that region. That was kind of the seat of the last seat of Seleucid power, and the Romans will come in and shortly take this area over, and then it'll be Parthia and Rome. We'll get into them probably in the next episode when we talk about the era around Caesar. Um, So this is kind of setting the stage for Caesar. So this is the first half of the first century BC. So 100 to about 50, because 49 is kind of once you get into 50, then you're getting into the triumvirate era.
Okay. Yeah, this is actually quite synchronistic that you chose this topic for today because one of the things that came up, in one of the last GICs that we did was there was going to ask the question about Alexander the Great, and I was told, wait, there's something else coming that this will apply to. Now today you're talking.
Yeah, we can talk about Alexander in a future episode for sure. Alexander's a very interesting character.
He would be his own. He would be his own show. Yeah.
Yeah, he would have his own show. Probably he would have a show. He probably would have two shows because his thing's really long and kind of convoluted. But um, with this, we have successor states to Alexander, most notably the Seleucids here and the Ptolemies here. These are states that were set up by the generals that served with Alexander after he died, and they divvied up his empire. Macedon, which would be north of Greece, was also one, as well as there's a few that have now been destroyed. But the last two were Seleucid Empire, and then finally Ptolemaic Egypt, all of which were basically assimilated into either Parthia or Rome. So Ptolemaic Egypt is, like I said, Greeks that are ruling Egypt. They would have identified as Greeks. Like Cleopatra was a white woman. This is something we need to kind of put away because
Exactly.
she was a Greek. She wouldn't have identified as an Egyptian in any other way than that she was a ruler of Egypt. She would have modeled herself after a Greek. So there's something we need to get rid of right away. And then yes, you still have a free Numidia in West Africa, northern West Africa, in like the area around Morocco. Between Morocco and Tunisia is the area called Numidia, and they were still free, and they had some of the best horsemen at the time. The Gauls, like you hear about Caesar and Gaul, that was still mostly free. The Germans have, so Rome has alliances with places up in there, but they're not actively controlling anything up in there. So the Germans and the Gauls and the Romans are all kind of fight in like a triangle at this time. The Britons rarely leave Britain at the time. And the Celtiberians are almost fully Romanized at this point because they've been under Roman rule for about 100 years. So this is the stage we set ourselves in. And by the end of this episode, we're going to set up the first triumvirate. And then the beginning of the next episode will be Caesar crossing the Rubicon. So that's just to give a time frame kind of for people. So the first major event in this period is the Social Wars. And this is an Italy-centric conflict. And basically, Rome during the Republican era, which we're firmly in the Republican era, the empire is basically 70 years away. Rome is at a point where the Senate class has a lot of men who do not want to share citizenship. So they don't want to give the vote to these fully Romanized Italians who were not of Latin descent, but who are, for all intents and purposes, Romans now. So these are Etruscans, these are Greeks, these are Samnites, people who have been fighting wars for Rome for about 150 years at this point, on and off. Some of them went to Carthage during the Punic Wars, but that was mostly because they just didn't want to be under Roman rule anymore. But for the most part, over the last 100 years, they have been Roman people. They've been living in Roman-run cities. They've been answering to the Romans for everything. And they want citizenship and voting rights and the rights that come with Roman citizenship, which so there's three five real classes in Rome: slave, free person, citizen, and then the base level of citizen would be plebeian. Then there would be a patrician, and then there would be like Senate class patrician, where like lower patricians would be considered usually equites, and then the upper class of patrician were like the senatorial level of patricians.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to break down those last two a bit here. So you get the slaves, though they have no rights, nothing. They're slaves. You could earn your freedom. It was very common with Roman slavery, the ancient world slavery in general, that you earn your freedom. Usually, so if you were enslaved in your like 20s, you were probably free by your 50s. You were enslaved through your prime, usually. And then children you had, there's a lot of law cases. Actually, some of the most law cases we have from ancient Rome talk about the legality of keeping a slave depending on when the mother had it. So if the mother was freed while she was pregnant, the kid was born a free person, sort of thing. Well, if she was freed like the day the kid was born, which is a very common practice, then there was like a where they freed after the child's already out of her, or they freed while she was in labor.
Mm.
Because if the child was already out of her, it's free. If it's not, then it's a slave still. And you could even earn money and buy your freedom, but usually it was like a thing that was granted after a certain amount of time, and then your name would change, and you'd adopt basically a version of the first name of the person that freed you as your new last name to show that you were once property of this person.
Mm.
But that's neither here nor there. So you have slave, then you have freed peoples. So freed peoples are peoples without citizenship, and that's what most of Italy was at this time. So these are people that are free of slavery, but are not given the right to vote or hold land within Rome, as well as serve in certain in most public offices. Uh, Basically, the best way to get this to understand these peoples is your elites from places that sided with Rome in wars and then were conquered, and they were just allowed to continue to rule the areas that they were, like stay as the elite peoples in this area.
Mm.
These were local peoples that had been freed of slavery or who had long since made treaties with Rome to just kind of become assimilated but aren't given citizenship. Then you have the first level of citizens, the plebeians. So these are your poor and average people in Rome. Uh, when like pleb has become like an insult today. In the ancient world, it would not have been seen that way because plebs were the first level of people with rights. Now they voted last, and if the votes needed to pass something, Romans voting was weird. So you'd vote in blocks based on your importance,
Mm-hmm.
and it would be by tribe essentially. Tribes are a thing that is hard to understand. Basically, it's the order in which they vote. There is some like identity type stuff attached to it, but we can't greatly speak to that because later on it gets muddied because people who finish military service are allowed to choose any tribe they want to join, which means whatever voting block they want to be in. But it's not a voting block as in like a political party. It's the order in which you vote when elections are called. So the you would have these so the first 10 tribes usually controlled every vote because every vote needed to pass something was in those. So if there was a stalemate after the first 10, then those other tribes would get called. And then they could vote. But rarely did they actually vote. If you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah.
So the plebs would vote usually only in the cases where that was necessary. The plebs could hold land, could hold higher offices. They could earn patricianship usually if their family becomes wealthy enough or they do certain deeds for the state. During the Second Punic War, you get a lot of people moving up from plebeian to patrician because of the amount of people that died. And so you can see that there is social growth, but it's hard. And usually it's a multi-generational thing. So if you're freed, you're not going to become a patrician by the end of your lifetime. Even if you become rich, you will never get that respect.
Ah, okay.
Um, unless there's a major disaster and the amount of money that you or whatever you can give can like save the state. But that I've never heard of it happening where somebody was freed from slavery and became a patrician in the same lifetime. Um, and then you have the equites. So equites are people who can basically fund themselves to outfit themselves as a horseman. So this is a lower level patrician, somebody who's rich, who has the respect of their other patricians, may not be in the Senate, but may hold some sort of assembly office or the like. And they could outfit themselves as a cavalryman for war, which meant that they didn't have to serve with the normal like foot soldiers. To be fair, Roman cavalry wasn't that good, but in like respect to other cavalries in the area, and they usually used cavalry from neighboring peoples they were allied with in wars. But the Equite tradition was like a thing, and they were a political class, and they were usually a swing class, so they could side with the plebs on issues, but they usually sided with the Senate and other patricians. But they were known to swing to the other side if they would get more out of it.
Hmm.
And then you had the senator level high patricians, the people that would run the republic. And most of these families were almost dynastic in the way that they held their senate seats. Uh, in fact, you'll see later on that one of the major players in this era that we're going to be talking about is the uncle, I believe, of Julius Caesar. Let me make sure I'm getting that right.
Interesting. Some of the information we were given matches, of course, some of this, where some of the channels that came through were talking about some of also like would be we would consider to be almost like corporations today, were in charge or mixed with politicians, senator, and yeah, where they had the different classes where some couldn't get to a certain tier or some, yeah, that was talked about a little bit. They didn't use the same words as we're
Yeah,
using.
so
Yeah.
by marriage, one of the major players during this period, Gaius Marius, is the paternal uncle by marriage of Julius Caesar.
Hmm.
So that shows like how close some of these families are. Um, actually, one of the cool things about Gaius Marius is he is a novus homo, which means he's newly moved up into senatorial level, but then he becomes super famous and runs Rome for a really long time. We'll talk about that. But one of the interesting things is we're starting this the year Julius Caesar is born. So Julius Caesar is born in 100 BC. So he will have seen all these events as in Rome whilst living. So let's just dive right in. We're going to start with the social war. So Italy, a lot of these other cities in Italy outside of Rome do not have, other than Roman colonies, which are places the Romans set up as cities, do not have these voting rights, citizenship, ability to be in offices. And they want it, and the Senate keeps saying no, so a lot of them break away and they revolt basically because a senator that realizes he could try to get power by like playing up these guys was like, oh, I'll go to them and basically be the champion of these Italians to do it. And instantly, Rome is kind of surrounded by hostile rebels, mostly in Etruria and Samnium, and those are Etruria is right north of Rome, modern day Tuscany, and Samnium is sort of the area between Rome and Naples today. So really close to the city of Rome. Not since the Second Punic War has Rome dealt with enemies this close to the city itself. And Marius and Sulla, who are the two kind of main guys for Rome at the time, uh, Sulla is subordinate to Marius in the army, but Sulla will ascend after this. And actually, during this, he'll get his own commands. They will go in and crush this, most of this, while the Senate starts realizing we're so screwed. We're going to offer citizenship to anyone that gives up, and about half give up, and about half keep fighting. The half that give up will get citizenship. The half that keep fighting end up enslaved. And actually, the one site I've worked at in Italy was burnt to the ground during Sulla during the Social War because he wasn't playing around, so he just burned the whole place to the ground. So then you have a period where now you have all these new people able to vote, and usually, but most of them again were never actually going to vote because votes rarely got to the point where they would have to go outside of the city of Rome to look for votes. Um, and then you get into this period where over in the Black Sea area you have the Mithridates in Pontus. I believe he's from Pontus. I'm like pulling some of this back up out of memory. So
Ah, yeah, yeah. You have a lot greater memory I do of the actual names. I know so a lot of these events, but it's like, yeah, the names always escape me. So, folks, if it looks like I'm staring off into
yes,
space, I'm
so
not. I'm actually here listening to him.
so
So,
he's from Pontus, which is in northern Anatolia, modern day Turkey. Sort of the bit that like is on the Black Sea coast in eastern Turkey, and then he held central Turkey as well. He would have he viewed himself as a Hellenistic king, but Pontus was sort of a mix of Eastern and Hellenistic, so kind of Greek, kind of Eastern. Um, and he was crazy. So first off, he would take a little bit of poison every day because he was paranoid people would poison him. And actually, this mixtures of poisons that he would give himself became like a cure all later on in history, where they called it Mithridatium after him. And this is an interesting thing because even like industrial revolution British monarchs were taking something called Mithridatium that was not even related ingredient wise to the original, but because the ingredients had changed over time in Europe, they they viewed it as a cure all, sort of like a Tylenol, but originally it was like people would take it to like ward off poisons, but it spread throughout Roman elite, and then it spread into the Middle Ages as this idea of I don't know when the cure all idea of it kind of became a thing, but it became a thing to take this to ward off poison. At some point, it turned into like a medicine.
mhm.
But yeah, he would take a little bit of poison, multiple different types of poison every day because he was paranoid somebody was going to try to poison him.
The
Apparently,
thing I was picking up on when you were talking about Pontus, I was looking up. I could see this figure in my head that was, like he'd just be standing outside, we'll say watching a sunrise or something, and he'd be drinking this poison like we would drink coffee. You know.
yeah, yeah, he would take little bits of multiple different types of poisons every day. Um, and apparently works because he did survive poisoning assassinations attempts. But then he went to war with the Romans, and the Romans crushed him. And I believe this is kind of where Pompey gets involved. I believe Pompey was the hero of the Mithridatic War, but yeah, so yeah, Pompey does become the hero of so Pompey becomes one of the triumvirs with Julius Caesar later. So so the social wars ended in 88 BC or 89 BC. And the Mithridatic War begins in 88. So it's an immediate kind of shift over. They go for 25 years till 63. And in this period, you've got various Roman rulers fighting over essentially northern Turkey. And as well as the Bosphorus, which is sort of where the Black Sea meets the Azov Sea, that little like other body of water right above it, where there's that little like break in the northern Black Sea. Uh so Mithridates finally gets defeated, and over the he would continuously be beaten back, sign peace treaties, and then kind of, you know what I mean? Like, then go back to fighting them. And that's why it took so long. So it was a series of wars. It wasn't one war. Uh, and then Mithridates' son would take control of Pontus later on, and his name is Pharnaces II, and he would become a client of Rome and would help them later on. And then Pontus would be absorbed later after that. Usually, what happens is you'd have a hostile enemy, then you'd have an allied enemy, an ally that was usually a descendant of the hostile enemy or somebody that you established, and then within a couple generations, the land was ceded to the people of Rome, and it was just given to them. That's how Rome got most of Western Anatolia, rather. Before this, there was a city called Halicarnassus, and they had a king, and Halicarnassus, which is actually where uh oh god, what's his name? Oh god. Shit. That's gonna come back to me at a weird time.
Yeah, I
Um
don't come back to you when it's not relevant. But yeah, this makes sense to what we were told that they would slowly kind of just assimilate.
Herodotus. It's where
Herodotus.
Herodotus is from, and Herodotus is the one that gave us the history of the Peloponnese, the history of the Greeks, and then the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. But Herodotus, that's where Herodotus was originally from, back like hundreds, like 300 years before this. Um, but so Herodotus is from there, so it's a famous Greek city. And when the king died, he was like, "I'm just going to give it to Rome," and so he did, and that's how the Romans got the western part of Turkey today. Um, so yeah, so we're getting into this period, and you got this fight between the Pontus and Rome. For all intents and purposes, it's a localized war. Uh, but there's like tax implications and things. So the Romans, who are always worried about money and revolts, uh, ended up just fighting for like control here because they still don't have like Italy fully pacified. For the most part, Greece is chill because the Greeks were basically told like you guys become like the smart people. The Greeks were really allowed to get away with whatever they wanted under Roman rule until later periods. And the Celtiberians, they were again left to their own devices for the most part, as long as they paid service to Rome, especially at this time because these were fringe places at that time. A few senators had their power backings in Greece and in Spain, but you'll see this later with Pompey when we go to the civil wars between him and Caesar. But so Pompey is kind of the new hero of the Mithridatic Wars. He comes back. I think he gets is when he gets the name Pompey Magnus, which means Pompey like the Great. Where's his biography? And Pompey's 9 years Caesar's elder, so he would have been a bit older. He may have even served in the social war as like a very young man. And all remember these are elite people, so they would have been raised to understand military life. Um yeah, so he became Pompey the Great in the Third Mithridatic War. And then right after the Mithridatic Wars is you get into 60 BC. Because the Mithridatic Wars go to 68. Wait, no, did I say 63? Around the same time, you have Sulla and Marius. Marius was the Novus Homo, kind of leader of Rome during the Social War, and then Sulla was like his second in command. Sulla started the wars with Pontus in the east, and then Sulla became a bit discouraged with the way Marius was kind of running things, because Marius was a populist, and Roman senators hated populists because they would appeal to the people.
Mhm.
And the idea of appealing to the people was not so bad in the past. deep in Roman history, it was okay to do that. Sometime between the First and Second Punic Wars, that becomes a taboo thing that you just don't do, even though it's legal to do it. And you have these two brothers called the Gracchi. Uh, Tiberius Gracchus and his brother Gaius Gracchus. They were tribunes of the plebs. So this was an office specifically made to sort of give the plebeians a voice. And they would then go to they could overturn certain laws. Now this is predating our era a little bit, but this is showing that there's a rise in people realizing if they get the people behind them, they can do stuff to subvert the Senate. And the Senate has both of these brothers killed. Both had power. So Tiberius was older. He had power basically in the 130s and dies in 133. And then his brother Gaius was about 10 years later. He died. He died pretty much the same situation because he tried going to the people, to the people's assemblies to get shit passed, usually land reforms, because there was a problem where there was too much urban poor in Rome, and the best way to do it would be to take land that was public land, but that senators abused. So most of these senators would like divvy up public land, which would still be considered held by the state, but would like open their own farms on it to then produce stuff for themselves that they could sell. And the idea was, okay, we're going to give this land to the people. And these senators were like, oh, no, we don't want you redistributing this land to the people. So we're going to have you killed. And these were the most corrupt, like, this is super corrupt, like, self-serving Roman Senate. And this is why, even though Rome was a republic, it was still an oligarchy for the most part. But you see this during the area of that you can see like this. If you go to the people, you might be able to get more done. And Marius realized he's in actual power in the Senate because he's famous and he's powerful. And so he goes to the people. Marius then leads. Marius makes decisions that the Senate doesn't like. And Sulla, who had always been Marius, is sort of inferior in the sense that he was one of Marius during his war with the Numidians and his famous events, was subservient to him as one of his commanders, now has his own command, and he's like, I'm going to champion the Senate. So they have a civil war. Again, it's all Italy-centric, this civil war, and Sulla wins. And Sulla does something that changes Roman politics forever. In the wake of the civil war, to set things right, Sulla declares himself dictator. Now, dictator is an office which the Romans did use. And basically, the way the Roman political system was set up is you would have consuls, and there would be two consuls annually elected, and they were both leaders of the state and the state's armies. Dictators were appointed by the Senate during very panicking times. During war, usually, to just basically get shit done and to protect the state. It was very rare that and most dictators were then stripped of power and would just go back to living their life properly because it was an emergency office. Sulla dictates himself dictator of Rome to make political change. And Sulla sets up prescription lists, which basically means these are people that I don't want. And it was basically big bounty lists, and if you killed them, you'd get stuff. And these were mostly his political opponents, almost entirely political opponents, or populists. He would then pass a bunch of reforms. He would do a land distribution to soldiers. And then Sulla would retire from all public office in life. He got what he wanted done and he quit. But it set the precedent now where if you were a general and you were strong enough, and no one else could really question you, or you had the backing of the Senate on top of that, you could make yourself dictator, get everything you want done, and take over. This is the same situation Caesar would do, Caesar, later on. He would do the same thing while his enemies in the Senate went to Greece to sort of to build up their army under Pompey. Caesar would do this, but he would mess up in one thing. He said he would be dictator for life. If he set himself up as dictator and did what he wanted and then left to go to fight the Parthians like he said he wanted to do, there's a good chance he would not have been assassinated. In fact, there's a lot of the big issues you see is that Caesar is kind of seen as this despot because he's taken the lover in Alexandria in the form of Cleopatra, and he has also said he's going to rule forever, like until his death. Which the idea the Romans are obsessed with this period, at least the Romans are obsessed with the idea that they can't have a king. So the word rex in Rome is like a big no-no. You can't say king. And a lot of Romans were starting to see Caesar view himself as a king. And that's why. And when he said he was going to be dictator for life, that cemented it. That's why when Augustus takes power later, which we'll talk about really deeply in the next episode, he will avoid the word king by creating imperator, which becomes emperor. But when he said it, it didn't really mean emperor. It meant first citizen. And he would do things where it looked like the Senate was still approving it, but he was just really making great political deals.
Okay.
But also,
he knew how to get around it well. Yeah.
Yeah, he knew how to get around it well. And if there was stuff he couldn't get around, he would kind of just like move other people into positions to get the shit done for him. Augustus was able to create an empire from Rome because he was able to play the political game so well after all his major opponents in the political theater were dealt with and dealt with in a way where they weren't looking like they were, where Augustus was like really taking over, because Augustus's major enemy was in his political side was Mark Antony. And they kind of had split the empire in two, and Mark Antony got the eastern provinces, which usually were the richer ones, and Augustus got the more old school central Roman provinces and Spain. But Antony set himself up with Cleopatra and then looked like an eastern despot king, whereas Augustus looked like the proper Roman man. And so the army was most of Mark Antony's army in the end was Eastern forces raised by Cleopatra, and then himself a few legions just loyal to him, whereas almost everyone else viewed him as a despot at this point and were willing to side with Augustus. So that's later on, but you're starting to see that you can, if you have this backing, you can take power through the people. And if you have an army that's behind you, it's very hard to deny that now.
Mm-hmm.
And Sulla never marched on Rome the way Caesar did, because you're not actually allowed to have an army unless it's a war in the area around Italy. Basically, when he crossed the Po, which is in northern Italy, that's a big deal. The Po and the Rubicon, that's like a big deal. So when he crossed the Rubicon, that's why that's like become a big deal, and he goes like the die is cast. Because unless there's a war in Italy and like another army attacking Rome, you're not allowed to have an army like close to the city at all.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's a big deal. Like even Roman emperors, they had their bodyguards, the Praetorians. They were stationed around the city, but they were never allowed to muster all together. And most of them were actually stationed outside the city and would have to come in the case of a problem. So yeah.
Yeah, I find it interesting, that this was the subject chosen because there's been all these synchronicities in such building leading up to this that first, they started from a different end. They started from around Jesus' time frame where we can get to that at some other point. But this uh I felt the point we were looking for points of infiltration. I always feel and I always see the points of infiltration are where there's just starting to be some social unrest when you have the beginnings of some divide somewhere, like the social wars, events before that. I know further back in Egypt, they had something in the what I know of the Osirian period, which is more in mythology, where you had the remnants of Atlantis that were in that period. But that's too far back. In the period we're talking about, is the feeling I got is when there started to be just slightly social unrest. Then you had the senators claiming this land, the others wanting to give it to the people. Then you had the seeds of a civil war building. You had the hedge betting starting. I always call this hedge bets of the gods because when you start to see a slight split, that is when you know there's a hedge bet taking place because, like you see now in the United States, political lines, social lines, everything. This is how they creep in with ideology, and also what we were told on a GIC at one point is that the Roman Empire would slowly just start to assimilate, generationally areas like what you just said, where they would slowly start to worm their people in and then eventually claim the land a couple generations later. So that if you want to avoid conflict, you start to alter slowly the ideology in an area where you have like this is what I saw in my own visions where it was like I was someone. This must be a past life related because I was seeing myself as a senator, basically saying, okay, we will put a person here that shares our ideology. We will make sure they ascend into a position of power. They start to slowly change the ideals over a period of time, and eventually, you know, this will be our own. This will be our puppet state for a little while, and eventually be our territory. So I've been seeing this lately coming up as past life, and I knew I had a senator past life, and I knew that I then slowly would put people and help put people in key positions. Do I know who that historical figure is? No. But when you mentioned it was like Paula, yeah, that's when you mentioned him. He rang true to me. Like I knew what he looked like. I could clearly see what his features were and everything. The I'm trying to see if I can bring this home. What I'm trying to say. Okay, the point you and I talked in a private session about the Peloponnesian Wars, how the hedge betting of the gods worked with armies. Also, the same with the 300 Spartans, how they work with armies. With Caesar, by the time that took place, by the time that civil war with him and Pompey took place, I feel the way that the supposed gods wanted their empire to form was basically through a dictatorship, but then wouldn't give the power back. Wanted to create that generationally, and eventually, you have someone like Octavius or Augustus, excuse me, or Octavian that
Yeah.
comes into power. The real name is Octavian, I believe, but
Yeah,
the
yeah. Yeah, it
yeah,
is.
people always screw it up by saying Octavius, but it's Octavian.
Yeah, he
But
just
yeah,
he forewent that name for his own purposes. A lot of Romans did that where they changed their name after great feats. Like Sulla, he becomes Felix, which means the lucky.
mm,
Um, and Scipio, one of the Scipios during the Second Punic War, he gets the moniker Africanus because he conquers. He goes to Africa and beats Carthaginian army led by Hannibal there. Both of them were working with scuffed armies as it was. So the Battle of Zama is a very strange battle, but we can get back. We can talk about that a different day. What you have to do is when you're looking at this is the Mithridatic thing, that's 88 to 63, right?
mm,
During this the Sulla thing happens in 80. So Sulla takes his thing in 80 and is dead by 78. he does everything he needs to do in like 82. He takes power in like 83, and by like 82, 80, he's given up power, gone to the countryside to live out the rest of his days, gets sick in 78 and dies. So he only lives like 2 years after that, and that's one of the reasons why he gets like he does well. So now you have the Mithridatic Wars continuing on for the next 12 years, basically. Well, no, a lot more than that, like 20 years at this point still. Um, and you've got people wanting to play this game, but not having a way to do it until you get down to the first triumvirate in the 60s. So Pompey wins, and Pontus becomes Pompey Magnus. Mithridates is gone. His son is put as like client guy. Pompey comes back. He's like the main man. Crassus is the richest man in Rome. And Caesar is, believe at the time, he's the one that brings them together. Because he's got an in with Crassus, and then he marries his daughter, or I think it's his daughter, Julia. Let me just
Yeah,
look
the
that.
nickname the Galactics like to give Crassus is Crassus the Butcher. They love to call him Crassus the Butcher.
Well, Crassus. I'll go into Crassus because we'll talk about how Crassus dies. Yeah. So Julia was Caesar's daughter, and he married her to Pompey, and it seemed like a legitimate love was there between Pompey and her. Um, and so that was the alliance between Pompey and Caesar, and then Crassus was already sort of a leader for like a patron of Caesar, and then the three come together and decide they're going to kind of run Rome together, and they do. They have a few opponents who can't really do too much against them, but does do some things. And the big thing is what each one wants out of this pairing. Caesar wants to get to be Pontifex Maximus, which he gets, which is like the highest religious office, sacrosanct, so he's not able to be attacked. He's also the reason why we have the modern calendar, basically, because he rearranges the calendar into the calendar that then is only very basically changed in the Middle Ages to become our calendar. And then he wants to lead armies into Gaul, modern day France. Crassus wants a triumph. So Crassus is going to take an army to Parthia and go butcher the Parthians if he can, which he can't, and to get his triumph, which is a big parade in Rome where you're dedicated as like a chosen of Mars, and it's a big military honor. And it's one of the few times the army's allowed into the cities for triumph parades. And and then you carry your enemy in chains behind, and then they're publicly executed usually. It's a big thing. You're dressed up like you're Mars. You're on a chariot. It's a whole big procedure. It's a very big honor in Roman politics. Pompey got one. Caesar will get one. Crassus wants one. So he wants to go to Parthia, and he's the money behind this. And then Pompey wants to settle his troops. So Pompey's troops from his wars in Pontus want to get their land distribution. So one of the things Marius did, and I said Marius and Sulla got into a war and Marius was in charge. Marius had reformed the military in a sense where it was no longer made of citizen soldiers who would like seasonally go for war, because it wasn't working anymore with the size of the empire and stuff and the military needs. So he reformed it into where the urban poor would fight for a term and then get citizenship through fighting, and then would be given a land distribution at the time when they retired. Pompey had veterans who were not yet approved for their land grant years after they had served. And basically, it was the general that they served under's job to secure them this land. So he wants that for his men, and he gets it through the triumvirate. most of them get really good estates in like Etruria, Samnium, places that were devastated during the Social and Sulla-Marian Wars. They got estates there, and they are very good Italian countryside areas. A few of them also, I think, get sent over to like Illyria, which is across from like northern Italy, north of Greece. I think some also get sent to Spain, but for the most part, most of them are settled in Italy, which is a really good place to be. Um, it's like the best place you can be realistically if you want to be able to be in the political discussion. Uh, so Crassus, the butcher thing, comes more from what he does in Rome. He has a real estate empire in the city itself and nearby cities, and what he would do is he had a team of slaves that were a private fire department,
Hmm.
and he would go to buildings that were burning and would offer to put out the fire if the person that owned the building sold it to him at like a stupidly low price. And then the slaves would put out the fire and he'd get like a nice new building or property. Uh, but if they didn't, he'd just let it burn. And then those slaves would try to stop actual fire brigades from coming to put it out.
Okay.
Um, that's one of the things Crassus did a lot of fucked up shit. Would like to make money. That's like that's a big one that you've heard of, but people know about. Um, so Crassus will support the other two, and then once they get what they want done, or Caesar's off in Gaul at this point. Pompey is kind of staying in Rome, being like a figurehead for the government. And then you have Crassus go off to the east to fight the Parthians in what is now the Middle East. He goes and is absolutely obliterated. So he dies, and there's the whole story about they pour molten gold down his throat because he's the richest man in Rome, whatever. His legionary standards are lost. It's a major disgrace. Both Pompey and Caesar are thinking about going over there, but both now, the thing that keeps Pompey and Caesar together, Julia dies around this time as well. Pompey remarries a political opponent of Caesar's daughter, apparently. And Caesar's off in Gaul, and Caesar, as much as he was a genius, him going into Gaul was always a bit of a problem with some of the other people in Rome, a lot of the other senators in Rome, because his pretense for going into Gaul was that a Roman allied tribe was attacking Roman allies in Gaul. It was a local dispute between two people that were named Roman allies. And so Caesar really wasn't supposed to go do anything. Caesar was not supposed to go do anything, and he did. And he chose the Gauls' side, and that was his pretense for going into Gaul. And then from there, he ends up conquering Gaul and genociding about a third of the population, enslaving the other third, and then the other third were allowed to kind of retain what they had. But there's still a lot of people mad at him about that. He also was neglecting his duties as Pontifex Maximus, which is why when later on, when him and Pompey are at war, the calendar's all fucked up. Once he comes back after that and is dictator, that's when he like fixes the calendar properly again. So he sets up his calendar, but then the calendar before that you had to shift days and stuff. So there was a and it hadn't been done in like 30 years. And so see, it had been so screwed up that Caesar had to make the new calendar. So they thought it was too late in the year to cross over to Greece when Caesar went to fight Pompey in Greece later on, when it was actually the prime time to cross over. But they thought it was like October, and so it was getting too bad to cross, and it really was like early September or something. So it was like weeks off, and Caesar has to fix that. But would have been fixed if he was doing his duties. Meanwhile, both of him, Pompey is starting to get in bed with Caesar's enemies in the Senate, and Caesar is becoming a bit more belligerent, not listening to senatorial things to come back to Rome to face justice for going into Rome there illegally. He doesn't, but his legions love him, and he's got a big support of his veterans. And it all boils down to Caesar crossing the Rubicon in 49, and that's where this episode will end.
Hmm. Yeah, that's actually very interesting. As you were talking, about Caesar, I pick up little blips and snippets as you've been going on. I saw the whole when Caesar's killed, and I see him going across the Rubicon. But when he was off in Gaul doing his thing, I could see Pompey and them just kind of collaborating in the background on how they were going to get rid of him. And when you're talking about Crassus, this was actually quite interesting. I saw the gold down the throat thing, and I saw how can I put it? When they call when you were talking about the buildings being on fire, I could literally see him telling his slaves to go set the fire. So it was like
Yeah, there was always accusations that Crassus had fire set, but it was
mhm.
never something that it was a definite. It was never a definitive thing. Like you couldn't prove it.
Yeah, he's. It looks like I figured he was the arsonist and the fireman in the same role because that's who like the energy seems to be honing in on is Crassus, and also the thing of it is though, where does Spartacus come into this?
Spartacus is later. Well, no, Spartacus is during this period as well, but it's not something that's really matters. It's a slave revolt, and actually Crassus and Pompey are both there. And Crassus thinks he's going to win a. This is early on. This is when Sulla would have still been around.
Hmm.
Um, so or no, this might be right after Sulla, but the triumvirate isn't set up yet. But I think Pompey comes back and assumes control. Oh yeah, because this is that period where Pompey has control. Pompey gets this stupid allowance where any military force within like a certain amount of miles of the sea he can like subvert and take control of. And Spartacus is sort of down by Naples today. He's actually camped on Mount Vesuvius at the time. And Crassus comes with an army and thinks he's going to get his triumph early, like before the triumvirate.
Hmm.
And is about to lead a force to take out Spartacus. Spartacus has already beat him like once in the same area. And Pompey shows up and takes control, and Crassus is like, "Oh, but these are my men." And Pompey's like, "Well, I have this senatorial decree. Are you going to go against the Senate?" And he's like, "No." And then Pompey, I think, beats him, and then Crassus gets like some of the credit, but not enough to get a triumph, and nobody gets a triumph out of that. And then most of them are crucified along the roads leading out of Rome. But
Yeah,
it's
that
not the Spartacus thing. The real Spartacus event is not a big deal. It was made a big deal through storytelling in the modern era. Um, it was really what it was a slave revolt led by enslaved gladiators that broke out of their gladiatorial school. Spartacus would have came out of Thrace, which is near where modern day like Istanbul is on the Greek side. Um, he wasn't that. He was a minor character who modern audiences pick up.
just clung to. Yeah, I kind of
Yeah,
figured that was
his
the case.
goal was to get out of the toe of Italy to Sicily, where then he could get a boat, and then him and his people could kind of get away. Um, from what I know, and he gets cut off, and then he can't escape, and then he goes back to Vesuvius, and from there he's messed up.
Yeah, and there's rumors that like Crixus tried to escape to Gaul and all this other. So there's two versions of history that I've
Well,
seen.
it's because they split. They no that there's Crixus is a they split, and some try to go north and get cut off, and some try to go south, but the majority stayed south. And then when Spartacus himself is taken out, there's another group that goes to like the heel of Italy, like down to the boot, like where like the bottom of the boot is. Uh, and they try to deal with Tarentum, but the Tyrrhenians, who are now Romans for all intents and purposes, like have big walls and they can't get in, and a Roman army catches up with them and slaughters them too. It's there was no surrender because they were enslaved. There was no like they couldn't surrender, and so it was like get out of Italy And somewhere say, yeah, Crixus was Gaul himself, so he probably wanted to just go back to Gaul.
Hmm.
Um, that's a super Gallic name. But crossing the Alps would have been hard. Most likely, what he would have had to do is try to get to Massalia, which is on the southern coast of modern day Marseille, the city of Marseille in France, and then go up from there because you wouldn't have to cross the Alps then. But it it would have been very. It was a fool's attempt to escape Italy. Probably getting to Sicily and then getting a ship, getting ships from there was their best bet. But they just didn't have the way to. Apparently, they had hired pirates to bring them across, and the pirates betrayed them.
Okay.
Um, the I mean, you also have the whole pirates were rampant in the Mediterranean at this point because partly because Rome wasn't policing it as well as they could, and I think that's why Pompey was given that special thing where he could take over forces within 100 miles because it was to combat piracy. Because around the same time, a young Caesar gets abducted by pirates, and he um basically tells them straight up, "When I am freed, when my ransom is paid, I'm going to go raise an army. I'm going to come back and kill all you people because you brought me to your base. You showed me where you are." And they thought it was funny and didn't take much like heed with it. And then he did exactly what he said he was going to do, and brought an army back and slaughtered them.
Mm.
And then
Okay.
I think he captured the leaders and like publicly crucified them too, like on his own property.
Yeah, and I know, the whole story with Crassus, the whole 2000 crucified on the road to Rome thing. I think some of it was more overbloated, but
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that is true. That those were the slaves from Spartacus's thing. But Crassus didn't get that much credit for it. It was Pompey who got credit because he assumed control right at the end.
yeah, okay. I figured that's what had happened. I think what the feeling I got was that they were trying to prevent Crassus from getting that status, no matter what.
There was a distinct group that did not want Crassus to get the stuff he wanted because he would have been rich and then he would have been extra powerful, and people didn't want that. As well as the fact that Crassus's family had always been rich for like 200 years at that point,
Hmm.
and were kind of seen as a bunch of jackasses anyway. So Crassus's family didn't have a great reputation at that point. Like there was a Crassus during the Second Punic War called Crassus Dives. He was kind of just a dickhead. Um, Crassus's family was always wealthy and always kind of vying for power that they were always just kept kind of just out of reach of. The triumvirate was Crassus's best attempt, and it would have worked if he would have won. If he would have won in Parthia, but the reason why he lost in Parthia was because of horse archers and the Romans didn't bring enough. And then they had a loyal ally in Armenia, which he didn't use. Like he just didn't utilize. Like the Armenians were like, "Oh yeah, you could cross through our land and get to where you want to go faster." But Crassus was like, "I don't want to," because Crassus left from Antioch, which would be like in the modern, like just north of Jerusalem, sort of on the coast, getting up towards Turkey. He would have had to go up and then over into Armenia through like eastern Anatolia and then into the Middle East and Armenia. He could have done that, and it would have worked a lot better for him. He would have been in the heartland of his enemy a lot quicker, and he was able to take a few cities, but then once the Parthian army showed up, his army was surrounded by horsemen and like slowly picked off over a course of a day, and then they broke off into a bunch of things, and the horses ran them down and captured them. And that's how Crassus got beat. Caesar was right before Caesar's death. He was planning to go avenge Crassus in the east against the Parthians, and he was assassinated like the day before he was going to leave. The reason the assassination happens when it does is because he was going to leave to go to Parthia with an army in the next couple days. Like it was down to like
Yeah.
within 3 or 4 days he was going to leave it, and
Yeah, and the senators did not want this. They wanted to reestablish their control. Yeah, so yeah, yeah. I keep being told to where we were looking for infiltration points that then eventually built this. I keep being told the social conflict, social wars.
The
So it's
social
like,
war is where I'm starting to where I believe the social war is a period where infiltration within the senatorial class was at its rise.
yeah, that's where
I'm actually thinking it predates this a bit, and it predates. So it started in between the Punic Wars, but then it was able to be seen. It's able to be seen most around here.
yeah, it was able to be
Um,
seen by the time social wars take place. I'm saying, yeah, Punic, and I'm seeing it further back than that, right about, um, God, what am I picking up on? Okay, yeah, some of it was Egypt, obviously, but
I'm saying like infiltration of the Roman system.
yeah,
Yeah,
the infiltrator of the Roman system was just prior to the social wars. I feel, yeah, just
I have a feeling that the initial infiltration was during the Punic Wars when they kind of changed the idea of appealing to the people. But
yes,
you're
okay,
not
yeah.
able to see in the historical record anything happening until the Gracchi and the Social Wars, where you
Mhm.
can start seeing that the infiltration has happened and that what's actually going on.
I'm being told anywhere there's a blot out in the historical record is an infiltration point. Anywhere where there's a blur period.
Yeah,
And you're like I'm just being told you're 100% correct. Where that's a blur point right there between Punic and social, where it's like this blur
yeah,
period.
we know stuff that goes on, but it's not as it's not as clear as
That's
everything.
where change is taking place, or other histories are being wiped.
Yeah,
Where something is being rearranged, records are being rearranged, kind of like a whole Nazi book burning type of thing,
yeah,
where
because
like that.
Rome during the period after the Punic Wars has a lot of soldiers, and they expand very quickly. They get Greece, they get most of Spain, and they get almost all of North Africa, except for the areas held by Egypt,
Mm-hmm,
within 2 generations of the Punic Wars ending, and then you go into the Gracchi around that point, and then you have the Social War 50 years later. And the Gracchi, if the Gracchi were successful in what they wanted to do, the
mm-hmm.
Social War probably would not have happened because Italian allies' land would have been redistributed properly, and you would have had a situation where Italy had become Roman citizens a lot sooner, and you wouldn't have had the need for the Senate to offer citizenship when they were backed into a corner during the Social War. Because the Social War only went the way it did for Rome because the Senate did eventually end up just acquiescing and going, well, we can give citizenship to the ones of you that set down now. Otherwise, Rome would have Otherwise, Rome would have lost its hegemony seat. An Italian group would have still controlled most of the Mediterranean, but you would not have had probably the city of Rome doing it. You likely would have had a league of Italian cities doing it.
Yeah, that's what. Mm-hmm, that's what I'm getting. That's where the timeline change happened, where there was that infiltration conflict. Somebody caught on, and it started. Then it started the conflict. By the time it reached the Gracchi and the social wars, there's something. Somebody caught on to what was actually happening and began a split. And in that blur period, they're calling it a blur period because the virtually no records. Anytime you hear them use the term blur period, that's what they're talking about. Whereas there's this, okay, apparently somebody wants to talk. I'm apparently saying it wrong. Okay. Mm. I'm picking up on the idea, but the words aren't coming. So let's see. Okay. I take it you want to talk, Isaac, since you were prolific in those periods of history and different one expression or another. Uh, you would be correct, sir. Okay. So, as I know, he was around in Greece during the Diluvian League. He was Alcibiades, that whole bit. But
I'm not
um,
surprised by that. He had some big failures as Alcibiades. Yep.
uh, when you said big failures, I heard somebody say epic failures and started laughing.
Oh yeah,
So
the whole Sicilian campaign for the during the that was big failure. All Alcibiades' fault.
yeah, and he's sitting around going, yep, 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 yep. So uh,
That's
Others are
why then
lap.
he went.
lap.
That's why then he went to Rome, not to Rome, to Sparta, and started shacking up with the one Spartan king's wife.
Uh, what? Somebody said, "Yep, that's his gig." Basically, shacks up with anything that walks. Usually for political gain back then. Isaac, yes, you will be the perfect one to talk this time. Then, all right, all right. True benevolent Isaac only. All right. Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Through the crystal, please. My brain can't take it this time, so you got to do the crystal. Okay. Yes, he's slightly brain damaged. You see, uh, pun intended, with him this time. The reason I sound so crass is that him and I have argued on this particular point with himself, whether the thing that was learned with him catching this was actually applicable to some sort of growth or spiritual growth or lesson versus that of asking what he wanted altogether, which was reactivating this part of his brain to be able to pick up on these things better in history. So if I sound a slight perturbed, this is actually why. Now, in the blur point, as I was trying to specify to him, but his thoughts were blurred a little. So I came in to explain. You have any periods in history, especially this one, and I say especially this one because this was a turning point or apex in history or a temporal watershed crossroads. Whereas, yes, a major event of lesser or greater value could take place, like what you were saying, the land would be redistributed and Rome would have solidified much quicker. Someone within that period between the Punic Wars and the Gracchi then caught on, as I was trying to relate to him, caught on to the infiltration method, by which then you slowly assimilate an area. People catch this on now, where they're catching on where within your political structures, both sides, and within your like neighborhoods or within your family structures or within anything where something either etheric or physical infiltrates a space or is a mole in some degree, or even during protests where you have some guy showing up holding a flaming bottle of somebody you don't know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Though these are called crisis actors. Now with Crassus, he had his own where they false flag operations, like what was said with the fires. This was something similar back then, where a series of events would take place that would corral people towards a particular set of ideas. It was always the idea of Rome becoming this big superpower. The hedge bet in this was, what would that look like? A series of nation states, one unified senate, or an emperor or imperator. It actually was elements all three. These were the dice that were being rolled then. The reason I got laughed at a little bit ago, even as time as Alcibiades, this was within my soul's purview and his and yours. Whereas you all played roles within the formation of Rome. You had the Pompey, Julius Caesar or Caesar civil war. You also had the Gracchi with Sulla and Marius. You also had the Punic Wars. You notice how it begins slowly, just funneling and expanding towards the formation of Rome. During that temporal apex period, and I do want to say any empire or any great thing could have been formed during that time. There were people that knew this because of the same way I'm communicating now. They knew this through a channel, through uh, beings that were dimensional and also wanting to hedge bed towards that temporal apex. Now, I will describe a temporal apex, and this is why I said in other recordings about why the Vatican uses the chronovisor. It is because it is sitting on a temporal apex or fracture. In this area, you have times of year. This is why the calendar was convoluted. You see, times of years where it intersected the strongest points by which then to exploit this energy eruption. Also, times of year in planetary rotations, and times of year like you have your Halloween, your Christmas solstice, all of those. And it was intentionally offset a little bit so the normal people couldn't grab a hold of the proper magic. Halloween is the exception to that rule. But as you notice, they don't make it a national holiday, as he likes to complain quite loudly about. But in this particular way, Julius Caesar comes in and realigns the calendar. He knows when to do certain things, but also I know I keep jumping around on the calendar, but this is important in these rotations. You have the blur period where they were deciding, who to hedge bet and who to nurture as the leading up to the formation of Rome. The reason for all the conflicts after is because this was the arm wrestling that was going on between the dimensional and galactic factions on how to make that happen. Very much like in your current political scenes happening. I'm not, for the sake of the channel, I'm not going to mention it's the order tragedy, order chaos comedy tragedy routine with the two political pundits of who is actually in control. These are cabal factions. The same went with your whole struggle in Florida with the hanging Chad and the voting situation where one was voted in and then all of a sudden there was a pause and then the other came in. These were actually blurred deciding points, the same in the Roman pre-Roman period, where you had these blur points where the narrative wasn't completely absolute. You see, the narrative is never absolute. There's always a plan A, plan B, C, D, E, F, G. If one doesn't work, they go down the list. And if it's spotted them going down the list and doing the bullet points or checkpoints, somebody objects going, no, I'm not giving this up. We're going ahead with this. Causes a little conflict. Hedge betting begins in that area because some of the galactics wanted to be opportunists. And there you have it. This period was very important. The part where, and this is where you ended the episode on Caesar crossing the Rubicon, where he says the dice fly high, pretty much. This is a very poignant piece of history that people don't get, that this was also a hedge bet of his own. He was rolling the dice. But who is he rolling the dice for? Whom did he serve? They say he served himself. No. He was serving galactic interest, Enlil being one of them. He was one that even in the biblical period where he was trying to reshape Israel. I will not go into that because that's not the discussion. That could be a different one. Unification of Israel, having Joshua conquer all the cities, etc., the walls of Jericho, that whole bit. This was something very similar to where the lines on a map were drastically changed, but you're thinking about think about beings that live multiple generations. They could literally see a plan through from its beginning, middle, and end, or however they want to reshape it. It's not really an end. It's a reshaping, a retelling, telling of a story, inventing a tale, inventing a mythology, inventing a worship, inventing a god, inventing a deity, inventing a cause. And this is how this eventually expands into eventually where the church would be. Who is the church? It's Christian, who they worship essentially Jesus, but that is an Enlil concoction. Again, won't go into that part. But you see the progression on the succession order and the pecking order. Some things also, like with some of your sporting events, he likes to say that the corruption in it is absolute. I have to fervently disagree, where the ending is not always predetermined. It's the journey, not necessarily the journey portion, but yes, they know who they want and they know what ads they want to put out or money they want to make from a particular sporting event, or say like in your last Super Bowl with your Kelsey and your Taylor Swift the mythology that was swarmed around it. It is very similar to what happened in the ancient past. It is actually quite the same how they built these narratives up around certain people, but does it determine always how the game goes? No. Now, in your Roman gladiatorial arena, again, they would distract the public from the concerns of the empire with this. Always when there was problems surrounding. This is very similar. You have a lot more problems in your immediate vicinity uh, than you think you do, and this is why they're distracting so heavily. It's the same thing with Rome, beer and circus kind of deal. Now, in that age, I keep circling back around to the Blur period because in that day, imagine people just sitting around, say, in a basement somewhere, and they want to plan out the next set of events over maybe 2 generations, maybe 3. They want to plan out how this goes. And this went with the Christian religion as a whole in the beginning too, where somebody went around planting the storytelling seeds of a religion. In this case, it was building the aspirations for an empire, building the aspirations and the ideas of what that would look like. What visuals can you put in people's head? The theater of the mind. What could you put in someone's head? What would that look like? And like you have people also in earlier politics where they would stand on a soapbox, standing on a soapbox and saying their piece. It's kind of like this, but like what your Council of Nicaea did for Christianity, it's very similar, where things built up to that. Where built up to this giant apex. Rome, when this gets forged, not just with the Republic, but with Caesar in particular, the dice did fly high because there were actually groups betting very heavily, galactic and earthly, on what that would look like. And like you said before, Ryan, would that be a group of nation states? Or would that be a republic? Or would that be an emperor? There was heavy, heavy betting on from different galactic sources and inner Earth sources of what that would look like. They were heavily involved. I myself, your aspects of both of you were heavily involved in the time. He was seeing from the perspective of a Roman senator divvying up land, but doing it quietly. By doing it quietly, by putting a person of interest in each spot, and then slowly allowing that takeover. And it's a sound familiar. This is also a Venusian idea. So this is like Venusian, Venice, Italy. Get it? So you have this is where the word came from. This is why he's sometimes at odds with Valiant Thor, because of the fact some of this has been used improperly by even factions of their own people. They were in the hedge betting game too. I should know. I was there. This is I have full recollection of different past lives that I can access across not only the multiversal board, but in the moment where you can just pull resources like Everything Everywhere All at Once, where she's pulling resources from the multiverse. You can become that essence of your oneself and rotate what you need to rotate in. This is why he picked up on the Roman senator immediately. So I will quit babbling. You can go into questions.
All right. One of the big ones in the beginning here is when they're infiltrating, they don't act quickly. They will do a thing, they will infiltrate early, and then they'll sit in the system and learn how to exploit it perfectly. That's why they were able to sort of get rid of the idea of going to the people for approval of things. And then they were able to exploit that going forward. And then when people were like, well, you could go to the people, that's how it was done in the past, they made it be this taboo thing that was seen as like unjust just because it was the way, just because it hadn't been evoked in so long. These are the kind of way they want to change systems in a way where, like, even though that's legally allowed, it's something seen as crazy and outlandish.
Hmm. Exactly.
And the idea that then later the people backing the ruler must have been a shock when Sulla did it. Because even though they had the senatorial class was backing him, most likely the infiltrators were backing Sulla or their factions. Um, I don't think that they at the time they thought that somebody would bring an army in, and I think that once that idea was put in their heads, then they were able to run with it with Caesar, and then when that didn't work to their exact plan, then they had to try to adapt, and that's why they changed it into more of the Augustus style thing using his nephew. Well, his
Hmm.
grandnephew.
Yes. Anything. Also, this is an important point. Anything that would give power to the people, they would avoid, especially by storytelling, basically saying it's taboo to do so. What do they do now? They basically say people are too stupid to make their own decisions. That's a popular viewpoint right now. It's because you have the psionic dampening, or what he calls the dumbing, put in place, even though by that very terminology puts a dumb class and a smart class in place. I've called him to task on that many times, even though him and the Force people find it fucking hilarious. Making fun of the movie The Happening, that's the joke. They find it hilarious. But I get it in the beginning, but I get why he gets sick of me ragging on about jokes over and over again. He's used it to an ad nauseum point. But in this way, where you see power being taken away from the people, it being made to look taboo, like what you said, that is an important distinction. Where the people would have set this right. This is why Sala and Marius were split, because one wanted to go with the original narrative plan. The other one went, no, I see what you're doing, away with that. And this is what caused this. And they had to act quickly, you see. Even though it was slow, where it was slow infiltration of an idea. Other factors, this is why you're seeing a confusion here. You're dealing with multiple factions. This is why you're seeing confusion now. You see, this is why not everybody is, why nobody's just speaking German and has an implant in their neck, is because the Martian Germans aren't the only ones involved. It's the same there, where you have others with their own selfish interests, and you have some that don't want a particular person in power, but yet they would become that if they could. Then you had some that were generally on the side of the people, and like the hero to the people type of scenario. That Sala, he had his own self-interest, but at the same time, he could literally see the people had no voice. And Marius and the rest of them later on felt that the regular people, they could do their thing, the plebeians could do their thing, but they would never ever be of the ascended class that the rest of them were. This is why in vision sequences, he thinks he was imagining some of this, where he was standing on a spaceship looking out over the earth in modern day, and then infiltrating different points with synths or synthoid life forms, or switching politics around. What do you think these groups did? We were showing him this the entire time. We told him this was poignant information, and it is leading up to this discussion. Somebody would stand in the background as he sees himself looking over the earth. Somebody would stand in the background and say, this needs to be switched and balanced out, kind of like a Section 31 group in your Star Trek lore, where they stand back and they move the chess pieces around, or in your Jason the Argonauts, where Zeus and Hera and the rest of the gods are playing chess, or moving the pieces around the board like a game of Risk. That is actually more accurate. So, with that said, any point that's blurred, at any point where you could clearly see that there was poo-pooing against the people in some way, making it taboo to actually side the people, that is an infiltration point. Also, like in his show that he's watched, he's talked about quite often, Gene Roddenberry's Earth Final Conflict, where they find a Roman senator that had been in stasis in an alien spaceship. And when one of the characters says, "Oh, we have one vote, one person to vote for a leader," the Roman senator goes, "There are so many things wrong with that. You know, that is not a good idea. Uh, because basically people have to be governed, not govern themselves, kind of thing." That was, he goes, "This is my opinion." Because we've seen even in modern politics where some of your pundits are saying, well, maybe it's not a good idea to have elections or have this or have that, have one person, because then it doesn't shift and change and you have a solid idea to work with over and over again. This is a bad idea because if you do not have it shift and change, two things happen: stagnant or revolt. And look what's happened when somebody says they're going to be the Hitler, Stalin, any of these dictators around the planet. You have these things happen. It's they try to say to stay firm as imperators or whatever they want to call themselves. It always is destined to fall. This is why the cabal doesn't get it, because they want to be imperator, or as the imperator group or totalitarianistic state. No group like that ever remains. There are good ones that, yeah, you need a checks and balances to rearrange, like you have your Section 31 in your Star Trek lore, where they make peace in war times, like they did it to the Klingon Kronos planet in your Star Trek Discovery. Yeah, there are exceptions to the rules where you have to get in there and change things. But imagine dozens of groups doing this, shifting and changing, shifting and changing. Who pays for this in the end? The people in between.
I think that's good.
Yes, I agree. He has his own thoughts that skew. I do want to say this. I'm not throwing him under the bus, but there is this split where he doesn't realize he's getting this from other realities, where some of his pieces sometimes will shift and change his thoughts or his SSP time, and he's remembering certain ideals that came from some of this hedge betting. What would he do? And it becomes a what if in his mind. If you have a what if that pops up, sometimes it is from these different lifetimes and expressions. I will just point this out, where he is seeing these different scenarios and how they acted. He's supposed to be learning from this. He's trying to figure out how to do business to enact certain good things, or change energies to enact certain good things and bring the good from those lifetimes. But you have to be careful not to mirror some of these old tendencies that somebody wants to regurgitate. Now, even in your defunct Assassin's Creed history, which is way off the mark history-wise, we know this. But where you have the past life that is actually the person that has the past life is one of the deities of some sort. That is true. That is absolutely true, and that's how they infiltrated the different areas. They couldn't get into the frequency per se, so they incarnated, like Odin did with his Scottish tavern owner, where he wanted to change certain things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this is where I will end this because it is important. Again, if you have any belief system out there that is okay with taking power away from the people, this is to be fervently avoided. Thank you. Oh, Cam. He was showing me image after image, like in a flip book type of thing of like snapshots of or screenshots of what was at that time, where I was seeing from the blur period that he was talking about. Literally, people were sitting in like a back room somewhere, or out in the wilderness somewhere, or would gather somewhere. Our government people do this too, where if they want to have a meeting, there's even a disinformation group known as the Aviary that's out right now. They're famous for just being in their mother's basement. I'm not joking. They're famous for being in the basement of a family member's house doing their shit. And that's the same thing. During the whole Jesus planning of the religion thing, I saw a past life where I was Nicodemus's son. I was a Roman centurion, and I saw this. Nicodemus is an interesting character. He's more one of the corporate arms of that time. But yeah, I'm surprised he didn't focus on Crassus too much, but he did a little bit. But yeah, he Isaac. If you try to get him to pinpoint who exactly he was, this is the area where he will beat around the bush a little bit. You have to really nail down who he was, because he's partially ashamed of his own history, so he won't always touch on it. But it was a learning point by which then, like what he was saying, that you're not supposed to bring in or mirror these other same bad tendencies to where history keeps repeating itself. That's why you can't tear down monuments, you can't get rid of history, because some things you're supposed to find offensive. You're supposed to find some things offensive so that you don't repeat them. and you have to learn them so you don't repeat them. That's essentially what he was attempting to say there as well. And so this has actually been interesting idea, folks. I didn't know that this was going to go this way today. I like it when it's a surprise because I'm a history buff myself. I may not always know the proper years and names like Ryan did. I sometimes don't. I don't. The numbers don't come together, but I do know the basics of it in that area. I do know some of the names. So, but that's how my brain operates. I'll go with more landmark events, and then Ryan, you go with more of those other little intricate
I
details.
mean,
I
I
like
have
that.
two hypotheses as to who he could have been during that period.
Hmm. Uh,
Um, I mean, I have he's either Cato the Elder,
mhm.
no, Cato the Younger,
Yeah.
or he's Cicero.
That would fit. I was seeing in my head before you said that. The character of Cicero from Skyrim, where he's the jester. Uh,
Yes, Cicero in Rome was very different to that Cicero, but he's still a very interesting.
I was seeing the jester from Elder Scrolls, or from Skyrim. So I'm assuming Isaac, this was you. I just heard him go, yeah. Uh, so that's all I heard.
Cicero
Yeah.
Cicero was really weird because he didn't like Caesar or any. Well, his Cicero survived Caesar, but he was around and he was the enemy of Caesar, and then he was killed during Octavian and Antony's prescriptions.
Hmm.
Um, he uh he was um he was an orator. He was like the best orator, which meant he was good at public speaking, and he was like a lawyer essentially, and he was often spoke on cases that have to do with like is the baby a slave or is the baby not a slave. He was oh I personally think that he was around during the whole Crassus uh crucifying 2,000 slaves thing. He fought in the military under Pompey. He didn't really like. I personally think he felt spurned that he was never given more
Hmm.
um command and stuff. He was well respected, but he never got like the level of fame that some of these other guys got. And I think that was something that he was opposed to. But he was also kind of a contrarian just naturally. He would go out of his way to like contradict whoever was ascendant,
Hmm.
regardless of what their position was.
Hmm.
And I think that was just him being bitter that he didn't have power in a
This
more
is.
significant stance. Because he was rich, he had his own holdings and stuff. He had a nice house in Rome. He had slaves, so like he was still a part of this patrician class, but he was never the top guy. His opinion was respected by all the top guys, though.
Mhm. Yeah, like I think he was poking at himself when you were just saying that because, uh, wanting to be the top guy, planning that it isn't all that's cracked up to be. It ends badly. This is what he was. Okay, yeah. So this is him you picked. So this is exactly him you picked.
Yeah.
So, Cicero. I kept seeing while before you mentioned the name as he was saying some of like he was around at that time. I kept seeing Cicero from Skyrim. Like, wait a minute, this can't be right. And then you said Cicero. So,
So Cicero, yeah, Cicero in the show, a really good representation of Cicero. Cicero in the show Rome, the HBO show Rome. He he's like a major character in that, and he's quite well represented there. And his assassination is seen as well, like it's more like his mercy killing is done by one of the main two characters of the show, and it's a very interesting moment in the show. So
I didn't see through that. I was going to ask you how accurate that was because the show, what I saw of it was interesting. So
it's
it was.
not perfect, but it's not bad if you don't like if you're just trying to get into that period of history. It's not bad.
So what? How did Cicero eventually die?
He's a political opponent of Antony um and
Cleopatra. Yeah,
Octavian.
Octavian. Yeah.
And when they have the second triumvirate, they do a prescription list too to get rid of political enemies, and he's on it. Not Octavian. Cicero famously hated Mark Antony, and Mark Antony kind of was like Cicero needs to be on the list.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, Isaac just said immediately when you said hated Mark Anthony, he said, yeah, because he was a douche. That's what I just
Well, I
heard.
mean, I know the current incarnation of Mark Antony, so that, yeah,
Uh, so you're saying he's still a douche then? Yeah, that's,
can be. He can be. I
yeah, no, so,
mean,
uh,
he's a politician today, so yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, synonymous with douchebag, he's said usually. He's poking at himself as he's saying he's basically making up for a lot of that crap he did back then. So that's interesting. I'm actually glad we were able to peg that. I don't know if you have anything more to add, Ryan. We can end it here.
No, but I think the next one will be like the 52 Jesus's birth type thing.
Okay, that one should be very, very interesting. So yeah, we'll end this here, folks. So I now close this circle with In True Benevolence, no conflicting agendas as of this moment in time. So thank you everybody for watching this. We're both history buffs, so I was surprised that this happened, but I it's a good surprise. So thank you everybody for watching. Bye bye now.
That or you if you want to do Alexander.
Yeah, Alexander will work too. Well, either one. Actually, why don't we just do Caesar and then we do Alexander? So
Yeah.
uh, okay, bye bye now.